I don't know how to start this. You might think I'm crazy, but I'm not. This is real. Every word of it. What happened to my village, to my family, and to all of us, is something I can never forget. I was born in a place that once had a name so beautiful it felt like poetry. It meant warmth, unity, and peace. Now they call it the Haunted Silence Village. It hurts to even say it out loud. It's as if all the good that once existed there has been swallowed by the darkness. But before everything fell apart, it was a place of life and love. My childhood in the village was simple and full of joy. We were like one big family. Everyone trusted each other. There was no need for locks or suspicion. Neighbors would visit almost every day, bringing warm bread or jars of honey. My parents always sent something back, a pie, a pot of soup, or freshly churned butter. I lived with my mother, father, grandmother, and grandfather in a small house with a garden that overflowed with flowers in the spring. My father was a hard-working man, always busy in the fields or chopping wood to keep the house warm. My mother spent her time in the kitchen, and I loved helping her. She'd teach me how to knead dough, chop vegetables, and season food just right. Grandmother was different. She loved telling stories, dark, haunting tales about spirits, witches, and curses. After dinner, we'd gather by the fire, and she'd start with, "Now, this is a true story." My grandfather would groan, saying, "Not again," but he'd always stay to listen. Even he couldn't resist her stories. My grandfather was strict about one thing, outsiders. "Never trust someone from outside the village," he'd say. "Marry within our people. Outsiders bring trouble, and trouble is a poison." At the time, I didn't understand why he cared so much, but now I wonder if he knew something we didn't. One winter evening, after dinner, grandmother called us all to sit by the fire. Snow was falling outside, and the wind howled softly through the trees. Her face was serious, her voice low. "Come closer," she said. "I need to tell you something." Grandfather sighed, shaking his head. "Not another story, woman. This is not just a story," she replied sharply. "This is something real. Something that happened long ago." We leaned in, the firelight flickering against her face. "Long ago," she began, her voice carrying an eerie weight, "there was a woman named Zoya. She lived far from here in the deep forest. People say she practiced satanic magic." I frowned. "Grandmother, what is satanic magic?" She hesitated, her eyes darkening. "It is a kind of evil," she said slowly. "Magic that comes from hatred and pain. Magic that twists the world into something terrible. Zoya, she cursed people. She used her power to bring suffering, not healing." I shivered but couldn't look away. "They say Zoya wasn't always like that," grandmother continued. "Long ago, she was just a girl like you. She and her mother went into the forest one day to pick berries for her father, who was working hard in the fields. But the forest was strange that day, silent and cold. The bushes were bare, and the shadows seemed to follow them. They went deeper, determined to find something, and they never came back. Some people say Zoya was taken by the forest. Others say she chose to stay. Whatever happened to her there, it changed her. When she returned, she wasn't the same. Her eyes were darker, her voice lower. She spoke to no one, and soon strange things began to happen. Crops failed. Livestock disappeared. Children fell sick. And always people whispered her name, Zoya. Grandfather shifted uncomfortably in his chair, muttering, "This is nonsense." But even he looked uneasy. "People say she cursed the village near the forest," grandmother said, "because of what they did to her, because they feared her and hated her. They called her a witch, chased her away, and burned her home. But she came back, and with her came the darkness." She looked at me then, her eyes piercing. "You must remember this," she said. "If you ever hear her name, or see someone you don't recognize in this village, stay away. And never, ever trust a stranger." I didn't know what to think. I had never heard of satanic magic before, never imagined something like that could be real. But her words lingered, heavy and cold. I looked at my mother, who was clutching her shawl tightly. My father stared into the fire, his jaw set. Grandfather didn't say another word, but I could see his hands trembling. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my grandmother's words echoing in my mind. Zoya. The name felt like a shadow, creeping into the corners of our home. Our village had been a place of warmth, trust, and life. But now all of that is gone. The name we once called it, so full of hope, has been forgotten. Now, people only call it the Haunted Silence Village. It hurts me to say it. It hurts to think about what was lost. But if you don't believe me, if you think this is just a story, then I'll tell you this. I saw it happen. I saw the darkness come. I saw what she did, and I don't think I'll ever escape it. After my grandmother finished her story, the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. None of us said much as we made our way to bed. Her words weighed on me like a heavy blanket, her voice still echoing in my mind. Zoya. The name clung to me, like a shadow following me into my dreams. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, felt like something more. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to come, but it never did. 2 days passed. The village felt different, quieter, heavier. My parents spoke less, and my mother seemed distant. She spent most of her time staring out the window, as if watching for something. Then, early one morning, my mother came into my room. Her face was pale, her eyes dark, and her hands trembled slightly as she touched my shoulder. "Get up," she said, her voice low and tense. "We have to go out. We need to pick and carry some things." I sat up, confused. "What things?" She didn't answer, just stared at me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "Just get dressed," she said. The air outside was cold and biting. The sun was hidden behind thick gray clouds, casting the forest in a dull, lifeless light. My mother walked ahead of me, her steps quick and purposeful. She carried a woven basket in one hand, her knuckles white from how tightly she gripped it. We entered the forest, and I noticed right away how different it felt. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent. The silence was so complete it felt suffocating. My mother didn't seem to notice. She stopped suddenly near a patch of flowers, if you could call them that. They were unlike anything I had ever seen. Their petals were dark purple, almost black, with veins of red running through them like tiny rivers of blood. The stems were twisted and sharp, their edges glinting like blades. My mother knelt down and began picking them carefully, her hands moving quickly but methodically. "What are these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're for protection," she said, not looking at me. I frowned. "Protection from what?" She paused for a moment, her shoulders stiffening. Then she said, "Just keep watch." I stood there, shivering, as she filled the basket. The flowers seemed almost alive, their petals trembling slightly even though there was no wind. When we returned home, my mother locked the door and every window, pulling the curtains closed as if shutting out the world. She placed the basket on the kitchen table and covered it with a dark cloth. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay in bed, listening to the creaks of the house, when I heard it, her voice. She was in the kitchen, talking to herself. Her words were low and guttural, a language I couldn't understand. I crept out of bed and tiptoed to the doorway. My mother was sitting at the table, the dark cloth removed from the basket. The flowers were arranged in a strange pattern, and she was muttering over them, her hands moving in slow, deliberate circles. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It was deeper, rougher, almost like growling. I backed away, my heart pounding. I didn't know what was happening, but I was too scared to ask. The next morning, I finally worked up the courage to speak. "Mom," I said hesitantly, "what were you doing last night?" She froze for a moment, then turned to me with a forced smile. "Nothing, sweetheart. Don't worry about it." But I couldn't stop worrying. I asked my father about it later, but he brushed me off. "She's fine," he said. "She's just tired." I wasn't convinced, and neither was my grandmother. When I mentioned it to her, she grabbed my hand tightly and whispered, "It's the curse. You mustn't speak of it." That night, the screams began. It was faint at first, distant, like a cry carried on the wind. But then it grew louder, more frantic. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. It was coming from the neighbor's house. Then I heard something else. A terrible, wet, ripping sound. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, and it made my stomach turn. I wanted to go to my parents, but I was frozen with fear. Then, as suddenly as it began, the screaming stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, even more terrifying than the noise. The next morning, I overheard my parents whispering. "What happened?" my father asked, his voice trembling. "They're gone," my mother replied. "All of them." I didn't understand what she meant until later, when I walked past the neighbor's house. The door was open, swinging in the breeze. Inside, the furniture was overturned, the walls streaked with dark stains. There was no sign of the family, and that was just the beginning. After the family next door vanished, everything felt wrong. I was terrified. Terrified for my mother, my father, my grandmother, and my grandfather. But it was my mother who worried me the most. She had changed. She barely spoke now, and when she did, her words were clipped and strange. She wouldn't eat, no matter how much we begged her to sit with us. And then one night, she said something that made my skin crawl. "Satanic magic," she whispered, her voice low and raspy. "It's here. It's all around us." My father overheard her and rushed into the room. "What did you say?" he demanded. But she just stared at him blankly, her lips moving as if repeating the words silently to herself. That night, my father found something hidden beneath the floorboards of our house. It was a strange, blackened object, an intricate star etched into wood, surrounded by symbols I didn't recognize. It looked old, too old, and burned into the surface of the star were markings that made me shiver. "It's satanic magic," my grandfather whispered, his face pale as he stared at the object. "I've seen this before. It's a curse." None of us knew what to say, but we all knew one thing. Something was happening to us. Something that couldn't be stopped. We were next. The following morning, my mother was gone. We searched the house, calling her name, but there was no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. My father's face darkened with fear, but he didn't show it. He turned to my grandfather and said, "We'll find her. We'll bring her back." Then he looked at me, his eyes steady but tired. "Stay here with your grandmother. Take care of her. I promise I'll come back." "With your mother?" I nodded, though my hands were shaking. My father and grandfather left, their footsteps crunching through the snow as they disappeared into the distance. I watched them go, my heart pounding in my chest. 2 hours passed, then 3, and still they didn't come back. I turned to my grandmother, who was sitting by the fire, her hands clasped tightly together. "Grandma," I said, my voice trembling, "we have to leave this village. We can't stay here." She shook her head. "We can't leave. It's too late for that." I didn't understand what she meant, but before I could ask, we heard a knock at the door. My grandmother's face turned pale. Slowly, she stood up, her movements stiff and hesitant. She motioned for me to stay where I was, then cautiously approached the door. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. "It's your neighbor," came the reply. The voice was urgent, almost panicked. "Please let me in. It's not safe out here." My grandmother hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. Then, finally, she unbolted the door and opened it just wide enough to see who was there. The neighbor stood in the doorway, his face pale and drenched with sweat. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting something to appear behind him. "You have to come with me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You'll be safe at my house. We can lock the doors and stay together. We don't have a choice anymore." For a moment, my grandmother didn't move. Then she nodded and turned to me. "Grab what you can carry," she said. We didn't argue. We couldn't. My grandmother and I gathered our coats and a few belongings, then followed the neighbor out into the cold, snow-covered night. The air was bitter, and the village felt lifeless, as if it had already been abandoned. When we reached his house, the neighbor quickly bolted the door behind us and closed all the curtains. His wife and children were huddled in the corner of the room, their faces pale and frightened. "This is just the beginning," the neighbor said quietly, his voice trembling. Something is out there, and it's coming for all of us. That night, none of us slept. The house was silent except for the sound of the wind howling outside. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. A faint scratching at the door. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But then it came again, louder this time. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I looked at my grandmother, who was sitting stiffly in her chair, her face pale. She shook her head silently, warning me not to move. The scratching stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was too quiet, as if the world outside had been swallowed by something. Then, suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door, followed by another, and another. The neighbor's wife screamed, clutching her children tightly. "Don't open it," the neighbor shouted, his voice panicked. But the banging didn't stop. It grew louder and more frantic, as if whatever was outside was desperate to get in. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We all sat there, frozen in fear, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, then hours, and still the silence remained. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The family was nice, she said, her voice trembling, as if the weight of her memories threatened to crush her. They took us in when we had nowhere else to go. They fed us, gave us a warm place to sleep. They tried their best to make us feel safe. But no matter how hard they tried, everything still felt wrong. The house was too quiet, even during the day. The kind of quiet that doesn't just come from silence but from something unseen, lurking, waiting. The children played in hushed voices, their laughter forced and unnatural. The mother tried to smile, but her hands shook every time she handed me a plate or touched my shoulder. That night, I woke up in a cold sweat. Something felt off. I reached out, expecting to feel my grandmother lying beside me, but the bed was empty. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Grandma," I whispered into the darkness. No answer. I thought maybe she had gone to the living room. Maybe she couldn't sleep and was sitting by the fire, warming herself. But when I got there, the fire had burned low, and the room was empty. Her shawl was still draped over the back of the chair. She hadn't taken it with her. I searched every corner of the house, whispering her name, my voice shaking, but she wasn't anywhere. Panicked, I woke the neighbor's husband. He rubbed his eyes, groggy and confused, but when he saw the fear on my face, he quickly got up. "We need to find her," I said, my voice cracking. "She's gone. She's not here." He grabbed his coat and lantern, his expression grim. I clutched his arm, begging him, "Don't go out there. It's not safe. Please don't go." He shook his head. "I'll find her," he said, his voice steady but distant, like he already knew he wasn't coming back. I watched him open the door, the cold wind rushing in and making the curtains flutter. He stepped into the night, the snow crunching under his boots. The light from his lantern flickered weakly as he walked further and further away, until it was swallowed by the darkness. And then, nothing. We waited. 2 hours passed. Then 3. He never came back. The silence in the house became unbearable, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. The neighbor's wife sat in the corner, clutching her children. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, her lips trembling as she muttered prayers under her breath. The children clung to her skirts, their faces buried in the fabric, too scared to even look at me. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. For 3 weeks, I stayed in that house, trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. Every second felt like an eternity. The days blurred together, each one colder and darker than the last. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional howling wind outside or the creak of the house settling in the snow. Each night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the scratching at the door to return, waiting for the banging to start again, waiting for whatever had taken my grandmother and the neighbor's husband to come for the rest of us. I couldn't take it anymore. The walls of that house felt like they were closing in on me, the air too thick to breathe. I had to leave. I told the family, told the mother and her child that I was leaving. I begged them to come with me, to run, to escape this cursed village. But they wouldn't. "We can't," the mother said, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale and gaunt. "It's too late for us." She turned away, holding her child close, as if the only thing she could do was wait for the inevitable. So I left them. I ran. I didn't stop to pack or think. I just ran. The snow was deep, the cold biting into my skin, but I didn't care. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I kept going. I don't even remember how far I went or how long I walked. The darkness seemed endless, the trees looming over me like silent witnesses to my fear. I didn't dare look back. Couldn't. And now, I'm here. I don't know what happened to my family. I don't know what became of that village. But I told the truth. Every word of it. If you don't believe me, I don't care. This is my story. And no matter what happens, no matter how much time passes, I will never go back there. Never. Unless one day I decide to return. For answers. Or for something more.